Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar titled Risk-Based Security Controls in Electrical Utilities. This event is brought to you by Security Magazine, and it is sponsored by Everbridge, G4S, HID, Proto Security, Salient Systems, and Winstead. I'm your moderator. I am Diane Ritchie, Editor-in-Chief of Security Magazine, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope everyone is safe and healthy and doing well. Today's presenter is David Jarrett. He is the Physical Security Senior Advisor at Southern California Edison. He specializes in workplace violence prevention, providing investigations, training, and physical security risk assessments. Just a reminder to submit your questions because later in the program, our presenters will address as many as possible. Also, today's event is being recorded and archived on securitymagazine.com, so you can share this with your friends and colleagues and watch it over again up for another year. Okay, so we're going to have some words from our sponsors. Everbridge's critical event management platform delivers organizational resilience for utility companies and enterprise large organizations, combining real-time monitoring, situational awareness, and integrated response and collaboration from a single enterprise-wide view.
If public services are under stress, it may put a heightened need for security at your sites as a result. G4S can help. We have highly trained security professionals on the ground around the world. Get in touch with the G4S team today.
HID Global powers the trusted identities of the world's people, places, and things. Millions of people globally use HID products and services to navigate their everyday lives. For more information, visit hidglobal.com. Proto Security has been in business for more than 10 years and offers managed, monitored, and direct security services to the industry. They are a first-time sponsor. Utilities and energy companies across the country have trusted Salient's powerful Complete View 2020 video management software to keep their sites safe and to provide real-time actionable information. Winstead is a global leader in security console solutions. The company creates attractive ergonomic consoles that improve operator comfort and optimize efficiency. Okay, just a quick note that about the fact that this is copyrighted material. Reproduction, distribution, display, and use of the presentation without written permission of the speaker is prohibited. One last housekeeping item. BNP Media is authorized to offer a CEU credit for this program. So participants completing this course may be eligible to receive that credit toward ASIS recertification. So in order to do that, you need to watch the webinar. Jump to the learning objectives here. I'll go ahead and read these and then we'll get started. The learning objectives are to discuss how to identify and prioritize risks for mitigation and to develop an approach to vetting technology for future risk-based applications, to recognize the importance of accurately conveying risks to C-suite stakeholders, to identify key characteristics of appropriate risk-based controls for an enterprise, such as an electrical utility, and to discuss the importance of implementing a defense-in-depth, layered approach to secure people, property, and assets. Thank you, everyone, for those housekeeping items. And now I'm going to turn over the presentation to David Jarrett.
Thank you, Diane, for the introduction. Thank you all for taking time out of your schedules to participate in today's webinar. I have found that sharing with others, not only in the utility sector, but in all of the security industry as a whole, often benefits me as much or more than those that I share with. I have learned to take and use the experiences, knowledge, training, and information from others and use those as appropriate to my specific situation or project. I see using those as building blocks to stand upon in furtherance of my objectives, and I think we all tend to do that. Today, I would like to share how we at SCE, Southern California Edison Corporate Security, see a need to ensure that our security and business functions partner align on each of these topics that we're going to be discussing today. We do so in order to provide the appropriate information, putting our identified security risk into context to assist our management team to make the most informed decisions possible. And we realize that the decision may not always be ours. As we talk about security technologies and services today presented in response to perceived risk or threat, we'll spend some time on how we identify risk, whether it's identified by ourselves or others within our company, a regulatory agency, or even our customers. We look for our end users to ensure that the solutions that we come up with are appropriate or most effective for the specific application. Do they address an identified risk? Are they in line with our security and business strategies? And do they provide value and flexibility and not impair operations? Now, impairing operations is not the same as changing a security culture, which is a whole nother training, or it should be or could be. In our security decisions in selecting and implementing the mitigations and controls, we look for those controls and mitigations that will provide us the best return on our investment. Do they integrate with our current system? What we use at SCE may not be appropriate for some of you listening today because they may not integrate with what you have. Are those mitigations and controls scalable? Do they add or enhance deterrence, detection, delay, assessment, and response capabilities? And in choosing the appropriate level of security at our site, first we look to see if we're addressing a regulatory compliance requirement. And we need to remind ourselves, and I remind myself quite often, that just because we're in compliance does not mean that is an appropriate level of security. And also, do they meet our own internal standards or requirements that we may have? And how are we going to ensure our security mitigations or controls at our facilities address all risks? Are we using a holistic approach? Are we identifying our prioritized assets? Are we identifying our prioritized risks? And then are we mitigating those prioritized risks? And does it improve or advance our security posture? If SCE's risk-informed decision-making framework, something we're going to spend some time talking about today. In identifying and guarding against risk, we also realize as employees that we are the first line of defense against the identified risk and yet to be identified risk. We believe a vital part of success is that we partner with our business stakeholders, including the end users, in preparing, initiating, and carrying out our plans. In 2010, the National Infrastructure Advisory Council submitted their final report and recommendations titled "A Framework for Establishing Critical Infrastructure Resilience Goals." In that, there are a couple of points that I kind of put, and I really think about when I'm looking at the mitigations or controls. Those points are: utilities harden assets and build in redundancy where it makes economic sense based on likely risk, cost, and impact. However, protecting against all risks to the electric grid is impractical. That is why rapid recovery is often the most cost-effective and flexible resilient strategy for the electric utility sector. And rapid recovery is not always at the top of mitigation options for security professionals, but should it be, or could at least be a consideration? Let's take a look at the tools our company, SCE, uses for making risk-based informed decisions. Our enterprise risk management team looks at our company's entire risk picture, the big picture, whereas we in security have a much smaller view which focuses on security. Let's take a look at the overview of the framework. The current SEE model, which currently is being reevaluated for possible changes or modifications. Now, depending on the type of mitigation, company-wide mitigation, say for instance, a cybersecurity software that's rolled out, or a mitigation at a single site, maybe surveillance cameras. In trying to come up with a common efficiency, a risk spend efficiency that we use in comparing these two types can be pretty challenging. And we're going to take a closer look at a couple of these tools. You can see that in this overview, we identify risk, evaluate the risk, identify the possible mitigations, evaluate the mitigations, and then we prioritize the spend. This risk evaluation tool uses two factors. It is a common tool used with many enterprise risk management teams where the impact or consequences and the frequency are the two factors. As you can see on the left-hand side, the impact under the impact dimensions, the consequence types are broken into 5 different categories, with safety being the closest, but still different than security. Security, where a bad actor or human threat and malevolence may not be appropriately accounted for. Our enterprise risk management tool and model is more often focused on the bigger picture, enterprise-wide, with an all hazards approach. That's why we need to make sure that we are able to provide a more focused look at the security risk. In this structure of a risk statement, using a bow tie analysis, adding a driver on the left-hand side and add value and clarity, and is getting close in an attempt to identifying the malevolent, bad actor, human factor, threat, event, but this is still lacking a more specific focus on security and the security risk assessment. Whether assessing individual or groups of facilities, we have found that for security, it may be better using a smaller scale of assessment than a typical ERM or enterprise risk management model, which looks at the big picture, the entire organization. In doing our assessments, we are aiming for objectivity when we look to develop a tiered approach, but we look to all of our stakeholders in our company, T&D or transmission and distribution, generation, corporate real estate, and business resiliency. They all may have various methods of looking at consequences. The consequence or asset value for T&D and generation may pertain to the amount of stability provided to the grid. For corporate real estate, it may look at the actual dollar value of the facility or site, and business resiliency may look more at the value of a process that occurs at a specific site. Creating risk-based tiers with standard mitigation can help lead into developing a tiered asset protection approach, which helps support long-term planning, not only in security, but for the bigger picture, helps support capital expenditures, and it helps with our general rate case submission. This is where I think the 3-factor risk model adds value by being able to quickly respond to a threat that may not be accurately identified using a 2-factor model, again, specifically focusing on the security picture. For objectivity, again, in using our 3-factor model, we look to our internal as well as law enforcement and government risk analysis to identify our threats, to identify our threat targets, to identify the likelihood of threats. For consequences, we look to our asset owners, whether it be T&D, generation, corporate real estate, or business resiliency. Does it provide stability to the grid, the value of the facility, value of the processes at the facility? However, when we get to the vulnerability portion, that's where security steps in. We own the vulnerability. This is a risk matrix using a two-factor model, an example used by another utility with a slight variation in the consequence types, where we at SCE use safety, reliability, environmental compliance, and financial factors. This model uses slightly different safety, environmental, financial, reputational, and reliability. This points out how whether we're using a 2 or 3 factor or some other model, they can and should be aligned with our company's missions, values, vision, and goals. With the 3-factor model, we can see in the threat ranking where the bad actor or human threat and malevolence act is accounted for. That bad actor or human threat may change rapidly, but if identified, it may provide more timely, accurate indication of potential risk and appropriate risk mitigation strategy. This is where we find that a consistency in an intelligence program, whether it be internal or you're tapping external sources, can pay huge dividends. The human threat may be personally, ideologically, or financially motivated. And we know that risk is in the future, not in the past. And if we only look at risk historically, we run into the risk of missing future risk. How do we rate a risk never seen or experienced before? What about Pearl Harbor, Oklahoma City bombing, or 9/11? Intelligence is not just a nice to have, it's a definite need to have. In asset rankings, we can see in this 3-factor model where there is injury or loss of life accounted for, the loss of processes or functions, and the loss of assets. And then in the vulnerability portion, we can see that redundancies in the physical protection, potential weaknesses or vulnerabilities identified, and those potential vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Again, you can see how, whether using a 2 or 3-factor or some other model, they can and should be aligned with our company's mission, value, goals, and vision. American Society for Testing Materials, in this excerpt from one of their standards, has listed here what I think is a great example and expression of the bad actor or human threat. The success of any forced entry, as with any physical attack, is dependent upon the cumulative effort of the tools used, the elapsed time, and the sophistication and motivation of the personnel affecting the forced entry. We have an opportunity in using our security risk assessment when regulators are looking at a risk-based justification for capital expenditures, whether it be used at the macro or enterprise level, talking about a black swan event, the phrase that was popularized by Nassim Taleb, which refers to the low-frequency, high-impact event. This is something he also referred to as a fragile event, one that should be built an anti-fragility to. One of the things that he said that kind of stuck with me, and it's something we all have to look at, not being an alarmist or a conspirator to mindset, but does the absence of evidence, do we look at that as evidence of the absence of a risk? In California, we see our Public Utilities Commission has various processes where they look for a risk-based justification for our spending. For those of you that may not be in the utilities, we have to go to the Public Utilities Commission to identify what our needs are based on risk for security devices to get the appropriate funding, whether it be through the general rate case, the GRC. This provides CPUC kind of a roadmap and a request for our funds. Something they started last year, or actually it was filed last year, is what's called the risk assessment mitigation phase. And it identifies the risk that we're trying to mitigate, the mitigation options that we've considered, the options that we've selected with their cost, but also a justification. And this is done in advance of our general rate case. So it gives the public utility the opportunity to see what we're going to be asking for. And even more recently, those of us in the electric utility industry in California now have a new CPUC decision, 1901-18, we refer to by its Senate bill number of 699. It's a new kind of a mini SIP 14 for those of you that know that program, but for priority distribution assets. And in that process, we do have to identify the risk, and we do have to show the methodologies that we're using and being able to justify what we're trying to do. Now, moving on to how we look at vetting new technologies, we've talked a lot about risk and how we look at our risk and how we use the risk, but now we're going to move on to how we vet new technologies that we may be using to address our identified risk. Drone or not to drone, that is the question. Scott Poskowski, in sharing his thoughts on technology and how it's changing the world, said something interesting one time. He said that we tend to look at new technology and the possible good that it may provide us, but a lot of times we don't think about how it might be used against us. One of the examples he gave was, think of the computer and the internet. When that was invented, I don't think very many people thought about how it might be used against us. So that's something that we really have to look at. When do we go all in with new technologies? Do we have a risk-based need? One that's identified right now? If we could do this particular mitigation, would it be classified, or would it be in that category of a nice to have, a want to have, or a need to have? Are the current risk-based needs that we've identified, are they going to be addressed, or can they be addressed with this technology? Or are there possible future risk-based needs that are either being forecasted or predicted? Are we looking at a technology that's proven? Is it something that's already existing? If it is already existing, is there a new application that they're trying to utilize it in? And very importantly, is the company proven? Do they have a good track record? We know that there are a lot of new companies that come around. One concern that we have is, if we go with their technology, will that company be here a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the road to help support technology that we have purchased? Is it an existing technology that may have new applications? From a proven company, these advanced thermal imaging cameras are now being considered for use to scan for body temperatures as a result of COVID-19. Would they be a nice to have, a want to have, or a need to have? And do they really provide value in identifying the body temperatures as we're trying to in this, or is it just one of those type of technologies that makes people feel good about using it. You know, we're trying to do something. These are things that we consider. Here is an offensive measure for drone mitigation. Great, nice to have, maybe, but can we even use offensive measures to combat drones, UAS, UAVs in the United States at this time? Outside of several three-letter government entities, we can't. But what we really want to look at when it comes to these type of measures, whether it's an offensive measure to combat drones or some other new technology, we want to be able to understand what that technology is and the current value that it may have or the potential future value that it may have. Because when and if laws are changed, we want to be able to know in advance, what are we going to do? How are we going to address this? Is there something out there that we can feel confident in using? Whether it be an offensive measure to combat drones. What about autonomous security patrol technology? It's already here. Could this meet a current risk-based need? Would it be a nice to have, a want to have, or a need to have? Or maybe just put on our future technology list? The augmented or artificial intelligence that it provides. One of our big go-tos in vetting the newest technology is looking for partners. When we make the decision to follow a new technology or an existing technology with a new application, we look at it for the value that it could currently provide us or the future value it may provide us. We look at whether or not we might be interested in piloting or rolling out a new technology. But we look at that with consideration of these organizations and agencies. What are they doing? We will often look to our industry partners for collaboration. We don't mind being the Mikey, the one to try something new, if we think it has value in addressing or identifying a future risk. Piloting a technology can be made more palatable when we do partner with other entities or agencies, and being able to share that information, share that technology and how it's being used and the effectiveness, or maybe the lack of effectiveness. That's extremely important, especially with the number of technologies that are on the market today addressing a wide range of needs. Some may be appropriate for our company that may not be appropriate for others. And conversely, some technologies someone else might be using may not be appropriate for us. But partnering with those other entities, sharing the information, testing things out, piloting things, we need to be able to accurately convey our justifications for our risk-based spending, not only to our regulators, but to our C-suites when the final decisions are made. And sometimes when it comes to new technology, we need all this information up front to be able to say, yes, this is something that we have confidence in, or yes, it's already been vetted, it's already been tested, it's already been piloted. In order to determine what our appetite is for risk, what's our company's appetite, you need to be able to understand what our current appetite for risk is. Can this appetite or will this appetite change? Are there other risks identified by our enterprise risk management or others that may increase or decrease this risk appetite? What do we want to do with our risk? Do we want to accept it? Do we want to transfer it, eliminate it, or do we want to mitigate it? We need to know that. In order to be able to accurately convey our security risks to our C-suite, we need to understand our company's mission, our vision, our values, our strategy. Security needs to be in line and to partner with the business. We need to be able to translate our security risk to a language of business, something that can be compared, a security risk that can be compared against an IT risk, but in a common language so that the management team can make the most appropriate decision on how we spend our money. This is when top management can make the most informed decisions. It's when we give them that information in a context that they can understand and in a context that they can relate and compare to the other risks. In speaking their language, it's more than that. We need to become a trusted security partner, not just the manager of our security assets and programs. We want to continue to work with our enterprise risk management team. We want to be able to help provide a common risk framework across the company where all risks, including security risks, can be more equally compared by our C-suite. When we use risk-based justification, this will help us and help our C-suite, our executives, people making those decisions to prioritize risk based on security spend to get the best return on our investments possible. What should we look for as key characteristics, though, in mitigations or controls that we want our C-suite support for? When do we know when to go to the C-suite? The key characteristics that we look for in any mitigations or controls must target the identified and prioritized assets. They must target the identified and prioritized risk to those assets, and they must be directed at mitigating the prioritized risk. They must also provide for continuous improvement or advancement of our security risk posture. Once we have these risks, how do we deploy these risk-based controls? This is where implementing defense in depth, layering our mitigations provides greater opportunity to deter, detect, delay, assess, or respond in securing first our people, our property, and our assets. Think of implementing defense in depth, adding those layers at a large substation in a remote area, which provides ample room for multiple layers of protection. You have the physical space to be able to implement those. How do we look at that? How do we implement those? Implementing defense in depth in layers at a multi-building complex where perimeter fences are not an option. How do we do that? Do we have to change the type of mitigations or controls that we might use again to deter, detect, delay, assess, and respond? And then what about in a single suite that may be leased in an office complex? Where do your layers of protection start? I mean, if you're only leasing one small suite in that complex, do they start at your doors? Maybe. Do you include the mitigations that the owner of the building may have in place? I would hope so. Hopefully those number of layers include those things, everything from the sidewalk to the edge of the building, to the entrance of the building, to the approach to your fleet, to those other interior portions. Implementing the layered approach. Defense in depth. We need to make sure that the identified assets to be protected are understood. What do those assets do? It gets back to making sure that we're working with our asset owners. You know, what does this transformer do? What does this circuit do? What does this other widget do? What is its operational function? How critical is that? And I find that when we do get to that end user, to that asset owner, we can develop a better understanding and a feel for what the mitigations and controls may be, something that's more in line with operations. And I think when we do that, we find that if there is a change in the current security culture, that it's more palatable and more acceptable by those end user employees because they've had a hand in it. They understand that we took the time to come out and speak with them, because I have found, and we find, that a lot of times that end user probably has a pretty good idea of where their vulnerabilities are and what they would like to protect and how it could be best protected. We need to envelop with layers of protection, and sometimes, especially on those single suite in a large building, we may want to start from the inside out, working from our interior assets and working out. It can help visualize where our mitigations and controls could be. Utilizing baseline mitigations or controls includes not only technology, but the processes and procedures around those. And I think that's where we need to make sure that we integrate those appropriately. Putting out a new technology without the appropriate supporting processes and procedures does not give that technology sometimes the ability to perform at its maximum, provide us the maximum return on our investment. Implementing defense in depth also helps us to provide redundancy, have multiple layers of technology and or controls and a mix of those. Sometimes it's just controls, processes, or procedures. But this helps in addressing these. It helps reduce the risk in protecting the asset and reducing the consequences. Continually monitoring for improvement will help our systems, procedures, and will help our risk. Today we've talked about quite a bit, talked about how we've identified and how we prioritize our risk. We spent a lot of time on that. I think that's very important. That's a very important first step. To go along with that, though, vetting the technology, especially new technology, is something that I think is incumbent upon all of us in the security industry to be on the cutting edge, to know what's out there, to know what the solutions are for the problems that we currently have and the problems that we may be facing in the future. So if an issue does arise, we already have a Rolodex or a context for a technology that we can roll out. Once we have our prioritized risk, once we have our technology, being able to accurately convey that risk to the C-suite stakeholders is extremely important, because no matter how good we are at identifying and prioritizing our risk, vetting new technology or methodology, unless we're able to appropriately convey that and be able to compare that against all other risks, we may fall short. We may not get the funding. We look at the key characteristics of those mitigations and controls. How do we identify the ones that would work best for us? And again, what might work good for SCE may not work good for you, and what might work for you may not work for us. In looking at enterprise-wide risk-based controls, we like to set up tiers or standards so there is a baseline that we look at. Yes, every site is different and every site may be unique and there may be some deviation from that baseline, but at least we have a starting point, and that starting point is something that can be shared throughout the organization. So when the C-suite is thinking about making decisions on applying some of our mitigations or controls, they have an idea of what those baseline controls would be and what they would cost and how they would work. And again, once you identified the risk, you've vetted the technology, you've conveyed that risk to the C-suite, you've got the okay, you've identified the key characteristics, you have your risk-based controls, you've got to be able to apply them in layers, defense and depth, in order to secure the people, the property, and the assets appropriately. Because if you don't do the defense and depth appropriately, if you don't roll these technologies and controls out properly, they won't perform as we thought. Again, I want to thank you all for joining the webinar today. In all things, safety and security is first, and securing our utilities with risk-based security controls is something that we have found does work. Hopefully, this information can help you and your organizations find those risk-based security controls that can work for you. Thank you again, and I'll give it back to Diane.
Thank you so much, David. Outstanding presentation. A lot of information here. I will certainly appreciate your time. Just want to remind everyone before we jump into the Q&A portion that we likely will not get to all of the questions, or hopefully we will, but if we don't, please go ahead and still continue to submit them, because I know that David has offered to answer questions offline. So David, first question for you. How important is standards-based solutions, or are standards-based solutions?
Well, I think they're very important. And as I touched on at the end, again, reemphasizing, you need to have a baseline. Baseline standards, same thing. You need to have a starting point, and that can be applied over what we call or refer to as tiers or different levels. We do group some of our facilities with similar criticalities and similar issues together. And so we have applied specific standards to those tiers. But again, like I said, those tiers are very important because they help prioritize the spend, but they also give the ability to forecast what those spends may be. But again, specific sites may need to deviate either above or below that standard, but that standard, if you don't have that starting point, and that's what we look at that standard as, the starting point, that baseline mitigations that we have found because of the site itself, the criticality of the site itself, we look to those. So I think that's extremely important.
Okay. How do you incorporate NERC requirements into your baseline standards?
And that's one of the questions I shared right up front. If we have a compliance, whether they be NERC or some other entity's compliance requirements, we will look to satisfy those. But again, when we look at those, just because we're compliant, just because we've answered those, does that really give us the level of security we need? So we look, first of all, if it is, again, a compliance issue, we address that compliance issue, but we look beyond the compliance, because sometimes that compliance may not cover the depth that we think that we might need.
A question came in is, can you give more specific suggestions for helping executives articulate or to start thinking in terms of a risk appetite? I assume we're talking about a C-suite here.
Yes, and I talk a lot about our enterprise risk management, and there is, and several people on this webinar may be aware of it and may be using it, enterprise security risk management is a newer concept. It's a newer way for us to do business in the security part. It aligns us better with the enterprise risk management. But as I pointed out earlier, the enterprise risk management is focused on all hazards, the whole enchilada, the whole company. We need to be able to focus that light on the security issue that we have, the security risk that we have. And we need to be able to help translate that into a language that can be understood by the C-suite so they know that they're comparing apples to apples when they're comparing a security risk maybe to some other type of risk in other parts of the company.
Okay. Let's see, another question. Where does drone risk fall on a prioritization scale here? There obviously are some concerns with the drone security with your utilities, correct?
Yes, there is.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, that is one of those newer risks, as I talked earlier. Drones are something that we actually use. Our company, we use them in doing overhead inspections,
sure.
Getting to our assets that may be in a very unique location geographically or ecologically. They provide a lot of good for us, just like the internet. Now, they provide a lot of good, but we know that they can be used against us. So we have some mitigations that we are rolling out. We're going to be using some drone detection radars. We are working with several organizations on drones and defending against drones. Again, to be offensive against drones, there's not a whole lot that we can do right now, but at least, and this is one of those very unique areas, we already know where we think we can go if things get really bad with drones or UASs. And we are kind of charting a path there. We want to start collecting that data, and that's what that is. Identifying the number of drones flying in your areas is data that can be utilized, and that's information that we can use to go to our C-suite and, let them know, hey, it's just not somebody out, flying a drone. We've got a drone coming over 10 times a day, 20 times a day, doing different things. So that is definitely an area of risk that we are looking at from a lot of different perspectives. Again, we're working with different companies and different technologies. Some are in the pilot stages. We're sharing a lot of information. That is a new risk that we are having to look at now quite heavily.
Can you talk a little bit about security's relationship with safety, the safety business unit, and how they are complementing at each other, if you have any direct experience in that area?
Yes, I do. And thank you for that question, whoever brought that. Security and safety are two different things. I think sometimes we do ourselves a disservice when we use them interchangeably. They're not. If you have a viable security program, that will increase the safety of your employees, your sites, your assets. The result of a good safety program can result in, increase in safety. And we know that. And we work very much so with what we call our BR, Business Resiliency Group. In fact, our structure within our company, we are structured, corporate security is structured with business resiliency and safety, another different organization that, again, we work within our company very well together. And I think that's very important because sometimes safety issues have nothing to do with security. Say, for instance, there's a broken sprinkler that's squirting water across a walkway. However, if you have a security officer patrolling that area and is aware of that and makes that notification, that's where security can complement safety. So They're two distinctly different things. I think they do complement each other well. I think working well together can benefit both sides and can benefit the company as whole.
Okay. Just a reminder, we have a couple minutes left, everyone, but please continue to send any more questions in case we don't get to it. Like I said, I know that David will answer them offline. What are your main concerns, David, with selecting the right mitigation or control for a specific risk?
Main concerns, as I mentioned earlier, is what's the appropriate control or mitigation? Sometimes we don't always get it right, whether it be that risk may change, the mitigation or control. And when I say control, that's including the processes and procedures. They may not address the risk as well as we had thought. But we need to realize that we won't always get it right. We need to make sure that this is where we do a lot of vetting of technologies and controls. This is where we share information. It's extremely important to share information within your industry. We do that quite often. I talked a little bit about one of the new CPUC decisions that has affected our electric utilities here on the West Coast in California. We talk with our joint utilities several times a week on this and other issues. We talk about similar risks that may be coming up, whether it's people that are coming around our facilities taking pictures, whether it's the increase in copper theft or vandalism of our sites. Because we find that because we're in a similar industry, that the geography, the geographical difference, our location doesn't make a whole lot of difference. That what we find happening in Southern California happens in Central California and Northern California. So we work with the other utilities, both the investor-owned utilities and the public utilities. We work with their security personnel on a regular basis. And again, I think that's very important because when and if one of us tries something new, whether it be a new fencing product, a new camera, a new software product, we're talking about those. Again, what might be good for one company may not be good for us, but at least we get their input on how that has worked for them. We belong to a number of organizations, and on the list today, one of those was North American Transmission Forum. One of the members of one of the companies shared about one of the technologies they had, something brand new that they got and how they're going to use it. That's extremely valuable because, again, why should all of us go out and buy a new widget when we don't know if it's proven yet? We don't mind being the Mikey. Yeah, we don't mind being the Mikey, and we don't mind piloting and checking that out. But, you know, why does everybody need to do that? And I think that just gives us more value for our company, but for the industry to be able to say, hey, yeah, this works, or this works in this situation or application, but it maybe not work so good in that one. So it's just a force multiplier when we're able to discuss things openly like that. Obviously, with critical infrastructure, as like a lot of other industries outside of the electric utility industry, there are a lot of confidential things, and you've got to have that confidentiality. And you have to be able to trust the people that you're discussing with, because the information that we have, that we use to protect our facilities, that information can be used against us if somebody's trying to break in our facilities. So when we do our compliance and we do our filings in public entities, we're very concerned and cognizant of making sure that those things that are confidential are kept confidential.
Well, great. Thank you so much, David, for your presentation and for answering all those great questions. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Everbridge, G4S, HID, Proto Security, Salient Systems, and Winstead. As you exit today's presentation, a survey will pop up, and we hope that you could take a couple of minutes to give us some feedback. We always take that feedback into consideration and make things better for you. So thanks, everyone. We hope everyone will still continue to stay safe and healthy, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day.